The Lord be with you. Let us pray. O God, who before the passion of your only begotten Son revealed his glory upon the holy mountain, grant to us that we, beholding by faith the light of his countenance, may be strengthened to bear our cross and be changed into his likeness from glory to glory. Through Jesus Christ our Lord, who lives and reigns with you and the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. It is my privilege this morning to introduce you to Bishop Mark Beckwith. We call him Mark, and you can too. He was with us yesterday, so I have some sense of what he might say today, and you are in for a treat. I'm not going to go through his resume because we don't have time. I am going to let you know that when you buy his book from the bookstore, you will be able to see some of what he's done on the back in the synopsis there. But in an effort to encapsulate it, though, he's done a lot of justice work from high school on, I think. But there's a consistent thread through all of that justice work, and that is finding common ground, building community, seeking reconciliation, which he has done and done very successfully. So he'll tell us something about that. Now, it's unusual enough to be in a place where you get a good message. But this morning, you're privileged to have a good messenger. And I think you'll sense in his humility and self-awareness some of what I'm talking about, which makes what he has to say all that much more powerful. So, Mark, we're glad you're with us.
Good morning. Can you hear me? Yes, okay, good. And thank you all for being here this morning, and a special thanks to Jeannie Mahood, who has been my shepherd in this process, to George for his connection, and also to Sam. Sam and I went to South Africa, I don't know how long ago it was, but it was quite an extraordinary experience, and it's an honor for me to be here with you. I was the Bishop of Newark in New Jersey for 12 years. I currently live in Jaffrey, New Hampshire. And when I came here yesterday, it was colder here than it was in New Hampshire. So somehow I felt that was a unique welcome for me. I have served, been ordained for 43 years and done a lot of urban ministry. And as George said, I've worked in a lot of different arenas and been a witness and a champion of several different issues that I'll talk about here. And what I want to do is sort of outline the nature of the book that I've written called Seeing the Unseen Beyond Prejudices, Paradigms, and Party Lines. Some of you who were here yesterday are going to hear a recurrent message around that, and I've expanded it to a little bit. And we'll have some time to get into some questions and answers. And one of the gifts that I have in my life is that I was in seminary before Sam. We were at the same place, but I was there. I graduated 4 years before he did. I was there when Henry Nouwen was a professor. Some of you know Henry Nouwen, know of Henry Nouwen. Wrote 100 books or so. Catholic priest, died about 15 years ago, and to my mind, next to Thomas Merton, is the most important spiritual writer of the 20th century. And I remember him saying at the beginning of a class, please don't pay so much attention to what I say, but instead pay attention to what emerges in you from what I say. So I invite you to sort of pay attention to what's stirring in your heart, into your soul, in your mind. I'm going to start with what started my book, an experience when I got to Newark in 2007, and there was a soup kitchen immediately next door to our building in downtown Newark, outdoor soup kitchen. And I paid attention to it because I'd started soup kitchens and worked in shelters, and this was a big part of my life and my ministry. And I watched these men, mostly men, coming to this outdoor feeding program. And after 2 weeks, I didn't see them anymore. Not that they went away, but I was focusing my attention somewhere else. I was on the 4th floor of our building, looking out across the diocese with 100 congregations, with all their challenges, opportunities, concerns, all of that. And so I didn't see these men except that they were foreground to the Passaic River. And the Passaic River is one of the lovely landscapes of North America. But there they were. I didn't see them. A couple years into my tenure, a priest in the diocese asked me, what goes on next door? And I said, well, there's a soup line. And she said, let's go. And so a group of us went next door, not to serve, but to have conversations. And I'm embarrassed to say this, but I found out as we went next door, there were 500 men a day coming to this next door feeding program. 250 in the morning, 250 in the afternoon. I didn't see them. After our time together, the group of us, there are 4 or 5, we debriefed our experience. What did we learn? What did we see? What did we feel? And the priest who sort of goaded me into going next door stuck her finger in my chest and said, don't you dare go just once. And so I didn't. And so every week I would go by and have conversations, develop some relationships. And what I learned over the course of time is that many of these men, there were some women and they ate in a different place, mostly men, either black or Hispanic, all of them, many of them lived with a level of courage and faith that had never been tested to that degree in me. And many of them became my teachers. Many of them became my teachers and were very important to me in the relationships that we built. Now, there was as you might imagine, a difference between me and everyone else. I was a bishop. They knew I was a bishop. I had an office on the 4th floor of this building that we owned. I drove a car. I had a ring. I had a purple shirt. I wore a cross. All these things that sort of made a difference between myself and everyone else. But we were able to work through that difference to the extent that that's possible and develop these relationships and hear each other's stories. As you might imagine, all, if not certainly most of them, were considered to be poor. Poor economically. Some of them lived in tents along the river. Some of them hung out at the train station 2 blocks away. Some of them had single-room occupancy places, and some just wandered around and around. And they were poor, and I began to realize that the language that we use causes some problems. We refer to the poor. Jesus refers to the poor. When he goes to his home synagogue, outlined in Luke 4, and he holds up the scroll from Isaiah, reads from Isaiah, the good news, I've come to bring good news, sight to the blind, bring sight to the blind, the lame will walk, the deaf will hear, and the poor will have good news preached to them. Everyone else will have something changed in them, but the poor will just have good news preached to them. And when he says the poor, and we've been saying the poor ever since, we are denying people of their stories and their names. We just say they're poor. Well, in fact, they're economically poor. And I remember when I was a freshman in college, we were visited by Bill Russell, who died a while ago, number 6, played for the Celtics, won 11 championships in 13 years, arguably one of the best basketball players ever to play the game, certainly the best rebounder and defender. I won't go on and on about basketball, but anyway, he came, large man, but even larger in dignity and eloquence. And he told the story of being in an airport, and a woman came up to him and said, "You're a basketball player." And very clearly and very quickly he said to her, "No, madam, I'm a man who plays basketball." His humanity came first. In the session we had yesterday, someone else had a Bill Russell story. He was on the Dick Cavett show, interviewed by Dick Cavett. And Dick Cavett said innocently, he thought, "Oh, you grew up poor." And Bill Russell corrected him, said, "No, I grew up in poverty. We were not poor. We were not poor." So we have all these languages, these words, these phrases that we use, and sometimes they deny people their stories and their names. Moving to the notion of mission, and certainly this soup line next door was a mission, and mission is a fundamental part of who we are as Christians. And if you sort of dissect the term mission, you go back 450 years, 400 of those 450 years in the West, mission was the idea of bringing God to places where God is not. Think of that for the moment. Think of the arrogance of that. Think when in fact God is present on every square inch of the earth, and the challenge in mission is to join God where God is already working. And we sometimes come with the arrogance that we're bringing God to a place that God is not. God is already there. And the challenge is to lift up the presence of God among everyone. And so we've revised that a little bit, the notion of mission. And typically in the West, in the wealthy West, and we are the wealthy West, mission has been the notion of doing for someone who has needs, has deep needs. And sometimes we need to do for others. If they don't have a place to live, we need to find them a place to live. If they don't have food, we need to find them food. They don't have clothes, the basic necessities of life. But what happens with that, in the doing for, it can reinforce the gap between those who have and those who don't. And so the challenge, I think, in mission is to be with, which is what I tried to do by going next door to this soup line, to be with. Because then everyone has a story to share, everyone has some wisdom to offer, and we can learn from one another. A classic example of this, I think, comes from the 24th chapter of Luke's Gospel. It's the Road to Emmaus story, which we read during the Easter season. And I'll recount it briefly for you. It's Easter Sunday, and two followers of Jesus are walking to Emmaus, 7 miles outside of Jerusalem. Jesus has been tortured, he's been killed. It's a dangerous thing to be anything associated with Jesus. They're getting out of town. And they meet a stranger. We know it's the risen Christ, but they don't know who he is. And there we go. He asks them rather coyly, what's been going on? As if he didn't know. He said, oh, you haven't heard? Oh gosh, our leader was arrested, he was tortured, he was killed, and now some women told us this morning he's come back to life. This is too much for us. We're going to Emmaus. And he says, can I go with you? And they say, sure. So for 7 miles, they develop a relationship, and Jesus recounts to them how God has been acting in history. They still don't know who he is. When they arrive at Emmaus, the followers of Jesus ask him, will you be our guest tonight? And he says, sure. So they check into the inn, come down for dinner, and at dinner, as the story says, Jesus takes the bread and breaks it. And in that moment of breaking it, they recognize who he is, and he vanishes from their sight. Now, in many ways, that story should not have been told the way it comes across in Scripture, because culturally culturally, it was expected that the followers of Jesus, when Jesus picked up the bread, they would say, oh, no, you're our guest. You're our guest. We break the bread. What's intriguing about that story is that the guest became the host, allowing the guest to be the host. And mission, I think, is allowing the guest to be the host, to enable ourselves to hear the fullness of the stories of other people, how they come to the realization of who they are. So that is a key component of mission. Now, we live currently in a time when polarization has become just so difficult. It grabs us in the stomach, it punches us in the chest, it makes life more and more difficult. And it is hard to conceive of some of these issues that I just talked about. And how do we get through it? How do we get out of it? And I think a key ingredient for this is the Italian word mandorla. M-A-N-D-O-R-L-A. Mandorla, which is the Italian word for almond. It is the shape that's created when two circles intersect. Think of Venn diagram from 6th grade math. And in medieval art, I'm going to press this, that is a mandorla. From Hildegard of Bingen, who was a spiritual master, contemporary of Francis of Assisi. And typically in medieval art, the mandorla was depicted as a place where people could gather in the middle. It was the intersection between heaven and earth. And Jesus lived in the mandorla and invited people into the mandorla. Today, I think in our world, one of the key mandorlas that we have is the intersection between red and blue. Red and blue. People who are more conservative, people who are more progressive. And there is a space. Sometimes it's rather narrow, sometimes it's broader. And these two circles can never be separated, and they can never overlap. And the challenge in the Christian faith, as I see it, is to invite people into the mandorla, where we can find common ground. An image of that is the Anastasis icon. The Anastasis icon, which is very prominent in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, and it's become very important to me. I pray before this icon every day. And you'll see Jesus, the risen Christ, in the mandorla. He's the risen Christ, and he's reaching down to pull Adam and Eve out of hell. They want to come out of hell, and he's pulling them out of hell. You cannot force someone into the mandorla. You can help them, you can invite them, but you can't compel them. And here are two people who want to come there. The first, traditionally, as we identify them as the first creatures, they come out and presumably they will bring other people out. What's interesting about this depiction of the risen Christ, this is an Orthodox tradition depiction. In the Orthodox tradition, Easter is a communal event. It's a communal event that everyone has the opportunity to experience the resurrection. In the West, it tends to be a personal process that I accept the resurrection. I accept Jesus Christ. It's a one-to-one kind of thing, an individual thing. And in the Orthodox tradition, which has more and more purchase on my soul, it's the notion of we're raising everybody up into the fullness of new life. One place where the mandorla has some energy is in the work that I've been involved with the past 4 or 5 years called Braver Angels. How many people are aware of Braver Angels? Several here, lots not. It was initially called Better Angels, formed after the 2016 election, when it was felt that the polarization is getting worse, and it has in the past 6 years. And so what happened is the leaders gathered 10 Clinton voters and 10 Trump voters in South Lebanon, Ohio, not to pull one side to the other, but to have a facilitated conversation. Can we find common ground? Can we find common ground? Since then, there have been 3,000-4,000 similar kinds of conversations held across the country. One of the state moderators in Georgia was here yesterday. Each state has a moderator, a red and a blue. When people gather together, the intent is to have people who identify one side or the other, not to pull them to once, but can we find common ground? And when common ground is identified, all sorts of things are able to happen. I've been working with Braver Angels, as I indicated, for about 4 years, and now we're reaching out to congregations across the country. And no surprise to me, and perhaps not to you, the Episcopal Church is sort of standing out in front because this is part of our DNA. When we were created as the Anglican Church in England in the 1500s, we were the way in between Catholicism and Protestantism. If you are asked, and my guess is that you often are, by friends who hear that you're an Episcopalian, "Oh, are you Protestant or Catholic?" And you can answer yes. We're either both Protestant and Catholic, or neither Protestant nor Catholic. We are the Mandorla. And we were created in tension. And for the most part, in the 500 years almost that we've been around, that tension offers a level of creativity. Because to enter the Mandorla, one has to risk, one has to be vulnerable, one has to be open to another side. And when one is able to do that, then new opportunities, new ideas, new possibilities begin to emerge. I refer to Braver Angels as the secular version of the Anglican movement. And it was first called Better Angels, Lincoln's first inaugural address, appealing to the better angels of our nature. Another group had that name. We decided to change it to Braver Angels because we need to be braver, braver in these very difficult times. And this is something that is growing in favor and importance and in allegiance. And in July, right after the 4th of July, we're going to have a convention. Our third convention, didn't have a couple during COVID. And we're hoping to bring partners into this convention at Gettysburg College, which will be the 160th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. Talk about tension then. It's no small fact that we're having this event right next to that battlefield, that historical battlefield, to make a witness that it's possible for us to be in relationship with one another across difference. What I think the Mandorla does, let me go back. The Mandorla does, it is an invitation to move from the ego to the soul. The ego to the soul. Now, the ego is very important to all of us. It got us all here this morning. The ego organizes our life, but at the same time, the ego is resistant to change, avoids risk, and avoids pain. And the challenge, I think, for us is to surrender to the soul. The soul is the place where love is generated, where imagination comes from. It's a place of creativity. And it's hard to get to the soul these days because there are forces and voices out there. And we all know where they are because we hear them endlessly. I call them fearmongers and anger entrepreneurs who sort of encourage us to take refuge in the outer side of our circle, where we can talk and think and be safe with the people who think and talk the same way that we do. And the issues, it's currently the case that if certain issues are raised, the ego immediately kicks in. Critical race theory, woke, climate change, you go on and on and on. All these issues, you hear the word, and the ego responds first and wants to protect itself, and it makes it very difficult to have conversation. So, I want to talk about one issue that I spend a lot of time working on, the whole area of guns. That's another thing that you mention guns and people line up on opposite sides of the room. And there's a strong feeling on both sides. How do we deal with this? How do we reconcile this? After the Newtown shooting in 2012, I helped form a group called Bishops United Against Gun Violence. And we're committed to reducing the scourge of gun violence. And when I retired 4 years ago, I continue on as the bishop liaison. So I spend a lot of time developing relationships with others in the gun violence prevention movement. And I realized shortly into my involvement here that I know next to nothing about guns. I last shot a gun when I was 12 years old as a Boy Scout. That's my experience. So I thought, I need to learn more. I need to travel to the other circle. So I went to a gun show. I went to a gun show in Massachusetts. And I was intrigued because there were all sorts of antique guns being sold. The one that would cost the most was $25,000. They're collectors of these historic weapons, but they're also accessories. And as I walked around, I was listening to conversation that I didn't understand. Not that they were talking a different language, but they were using words and metaphors that was foreign to me. And they were talking about it with incredible passion. And I began to realize, oh, this is part of American culture. Guns are a part of American culture from the very beginning. And some of the resistance that people from my side bring is the fear that we want to take away that culture. Not just take away guns, but to erase that culture. And I realized as I was at this gun show that I can come at this issue with a level of arrogance, smugness, and self-righteousness that just infuriates the other side. I've done a lot of podcasts now with gun rights folks. And we talk with each other, and we don't agree on many things, but we are able to, respectively on each side, get to a place where our arrogance is less apparent. And when we are able to do that, then we can start talking. Compromise and common ground are two different things. The challenge is to find compromise. And it's a challenging thing in our culture. The gun violence is going up. How best to deal with that? And there are two very different responses, at least at the outer end of the continuum. One says, if we have more guns, we'll be safer. The other says, if we have less guns, we will be safer. I refer to that as a koan. I lived in Japan for a while. For 2 years. A koan is a Zen term, K-O-A-N. It's an unsolvable problem. Unsolvable problem. We have some koans in the Christian faith. Jesus says, the last shall be first and the first shall be last. That is a koan. And the challenge with the koan is to sit with it. Not to try and solve it right away, but to sit with it and to see if something emerges. To live in that tension. And to have the confidence, the faith, the hope that something will emerge. My favorite definition of hope, I said it twice yesterday, comes from Jim Wallace, the founder of the Sojourners community in Washington, D.C., an evangelical Christian, but very much involved in social justice. Hope is believing in spite of the evidence and then watching the evidence change. I've become more and more committed to hope. Now, let me tell you, there are days that I want to just hide under a rock. The polarization is just too fierce. These issues are just too intractable. I'm just going to live in the shadow of the mountain in New Hampshire where I reside. But then I meet other people who are saying, no, we are people of faith. We can move through this. And to my mind, we as Episcopalians are uniquely positioned to be reconcilers in the world. And I'm going to finish with this and then invite in questions. Every Sunday, when we have the Eucharist, we engage in an act of reconciliation. Call it the exchange of the peace. I remember when the peace was introduced, some of you may remember in the early 1970s, the congregation I attended, and Mike Flock and I were in the same congregation. We were high school classmates. We saw each other yesterday for the first time in 50 years. Anyway, in that congregation in Connecticut, when the peace was introduced, people sat down, some people walked out. I'm here to worship God, not to pay attention to the person to the right or left of me. And my father said to me, he thought the peace was some public relations campaign cooked up by headquarters to thaw out the frozen chosen Episcopalians. In some ways it worked, but I told him, as a religion major at the time, and I said, no, it comes from the 5th chapter of Matthew's gospel, which was the gospel for last week. If you're bringing a gift to the altar, and remember that your brother or sister has something against you, put your gift down and be reconciled to your brother or sister. Then pick up your gift and go to the altar. The peace is an symbolic act of reconciliation. The person we turn to and exchange the peace with represents someone with whom we need to be in peace with. As I often say, if the person standing next to us is the person we live with, often that's the person we most need to make peace with. It is making the statement to each other, to the church, and especially to the world, that whatever separates us, and oh, sweet Jesus, is there a lot that separates us, can be brought together through the reconciling love of Christ. That is our work. In some ways, it's the most important work that we can do. How do we start? Do we have to engage in all these intractable issues? Sometimes it's just starting with the family. Braver Angels has a program called, the name of which escapes me, but it's a training to help people get through Thanksgiving and Christmas. What do you not say? How do you listen to one another? Because typically we listen and we're not really listening, we're responding as we're listening. But to really listen to one another, to see where somebody's soul is. And sometimes it's hard to find because we converse on an ego level and we want to dominate or we want to win or want to be right. And that just escalates the problem, and it makes it very, very difficult for us to move forward. So I think that we as Episcopalians, again, are uniquely positioned because of our history, because of the essence of who we are, that we can be reconcilers, that we can invite ourselves, invite others into the mandorla, and in so doing, to become free in another way. One way of thinking about entering the mandorla is the notion of surrender. And virtually every religious tradition that I'm aware of has an invitation to surrender, to give ourselves over to God. Islam does that, Judaism does that, Christianity does that, to surrender. And if you wonder how to surrender, I invite you to walk the labyrinth out there. I did it last night and this morning. And when you walk the labyrinth, you have to surrender to the notion that it's going to take you where you need to go because you can't figure it out. And it's a wonderful exercise to sort of let go of the ego, I'm in charge, and instead, no, this pathway leads me along the right way to the center. I'm going to stop there and invite any comments, questions, refutations, critiques, whatever. Yes, ma'am. A bookstore. Right. Good. The bookstore, and my books are in the bookstore, so I encourage you to go to the bookstore. And so, yes.
Thank you so much. This is wonderful. I was wondering if you could say more about that difference in the ego and the soul. I think it's really powerful to think of our responses to a lot of things that are polarizing as an ego response. And I would just love to hear more about that, or maybe even some more strategies for recognizing what is ego and what is where we actually need to surrender to the soul. I just think that's very powerful.
Yeah, I'll go to an issue. Many years ago, I was invited to be on a panel with Braver Angels. I was one of two gun violence prevention people debating people to gun rights folks. And as we started, it wasn't well designed. And let me say that almost all of the workshops and processes of Braver Angels have been designed by the chairman of a family therapy department at the University of Minnesota. So it's sort of like family therapy. But when we got into this debate and people were on the other side were saying things, I was listening to respond, and my first instinct was to want to win. And I didn't like myself. And I couldn't stop myself. And what I've learned is, and Braver Angels is very good at doing this, when they gather people together, there are norms and protocols that convey to people this will be a safe space, that you can share your opinions, provided that you don't do ad hominem attacks on the other side, but that you listen. But I remember my ego kicked up and I wanted to win. And the athlete in me, I got really competitive and all that. And I didn't recognize it in the moment. Since then, I think I recognize it more. But we get defensive. The ego gets defensive. And again, there are forces and voices out there on all sides who want us to respond at the level of the ego, because they get more money and they get more attention. And it doesn't move the needle. It just keeps people at opposite sides. I talked about language earlier. Early on in my work with gun violence prevention, I was at a meeting with several people, and one of whom was somebody who's been working in this field for a long time. His brother was an FBI agent, was killed in his office in Washington, D.C. about 30 years ago. And just innocently, I thought I used the word gun control. He slapped me on the wrist and he said, "Please don't use that term." I said, "Well, okay, why is that?" And he said, "As soon as you say gun control, people line up on opposite sides of the room. It becomes a conversation about the Second Amendment, and you're not going to get anywhere. Use gun safety. Use gun safety." And I've been on a sort of a low-grade campaign writing to journalists and asking them not to use the term gun control because it just inflames people. And it causes people to then get into their ego place, and then they want to win. And I remember reading a book a bunch of years ago from a professor at Episcopal Divinity School in Cambridge, and the title of the book was "I Win, We Lose." And we are in a world now that if in this notion of if I win, we all lose. We all lose. And the Christian faith and the, I call it the secular version of the Christian faith, Braver Angels, to my mind, is inviting people into that space, into that soul place, into that mandorla space, which I think is so critically important. Will it work? I hope so. I have hope. There are lots of groups out there across the country that are what we call bridge building groups. There's a challenge, though. Many of them, Braver Angels less so than others, tend to really lean blue. And there's this notion, it's like mission, I'm going to bring God to places where God is not. Well, the people who hear that they're bringing God to them, well, I already got God. I don't want your God. And part of mission, as we've inherited, is to bring God to places where God is not, is we want to make other people like us. We can't do that. We are all gifted in our own unique ways, and to live into that in a full way. Other comments or questions? Yes, sir.
Okay, so I think a lot of people in this room who know the four of us sitting here, a lot of people in this room who know the four of us sitting here know that we're deep blue, they're deep red, and we're best friends. And it's because we love each other's soul, and it's because we work at it. It's not always easy. We do have our disagreements, but you know what? We love each other, and we learn from each other.
Thank you for that witness. And my best friend in Braver Angels is Carlos Hernandez. He wouldn't mind me saying his name. He lives in San Francisco. He's a Hispanic man, and he's a deep red. And he and I will occasionally agree on a vote to adjourn. And he keeps calling me bishop, and I keep calling him my disciple, and have this deep, deep relationship. And somebody was asking me yesterday at the Lambeth Conference in 2008, which is the gathering of all the bishops around the world. I attended, and the presenting issue was sexuality. This is 5 years after Gene Robinson was consecrated Bishop of New Hampshire, and much of the non-Western world was really, really upset. And it seemed like we were going to split. two things happened. One is, it was, I think, discovered sort of organically that our relationships were deeper than our differences. And that was really important. And we were addressed at the Lambeth Conference, 700 bishops, spouses, staff, 1,000, 1,200 people, by Jonathan Sacks, who was then the chief rabbi in England. He died a couple years ago, and he wrote several different books. And what I didn't know, what we didn't know, is this rabbi grew up in Anglican schools in England. So he knew all about us. And he said with great passion, actually he shouted it, he said, "You're the largest volunteer organization in the world." And I'm thinking, okay, maybe the Catholic Church isn't a voluntary organization, but so I go with it. We're the largest voluntary organization in the world. You have to stay together for the sake of the rest of us. Because if the biggest among us splits, that's just going to be a virus that everybody else is going to catch. And we have stuck together because, again, we were created in tension. And sometimes we don't live in that tension very well, but it's in our essence. It's in our essence until we can agree to disagree, because we're grounded in this reconciling love of Christ, which we may perceive or express in different ways. But it's so, so important. It's so, so important. That was really heartening for me. Yes, sir?
Well, wouldn't it seem like the Episcopal Church needs to be in the middle, as opposed to, it feels like it's a little on the blue side?
It's really...
It's on the blue side.
Well, that may be demographically over the years. It certainly wasn't the congregation that Mike and I grew up in. But I would... I'll repeat the question. Could it be that the Episcopal Church is in the middle and it seems like it's more on the blue side? And I think demographically that may be the case. Although as I talk to bishops around the country, trying to engage them in Braver Angels work, several of them, I'm thinking of the Bishop of North Carolina in particular, he said, this red-blue tension, this is the water we swim in. And we need help to figure out how we can swim and nobody drown. And I think that's just really, really, it's hard to do. People, they get nervous around this. But not to call the four of you out, but you have an example right here. Right here. I mean, that's very powerful. I'm sorry? There's hope. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, Michael.
I think we all understand how ego can be an enemy.
Yeah.
I think we all understand about the polarization in the country between the red and the blue. But individuals are important. Not the ego, but individuals. And I think the Bible speaks to individuals, but how would you reconcile, I guess, the role of an individual, not the ego, but in trying to manage through the polarization that is dividing our country now?
Well, as I understand the ministry and the words of Jesus, it was this inclusive notion. He spoke to outcasts and sinners, and he got in trouble for that. And his message was to everyone. And there are days when I want to limit my message or my encounters to the people who I'm most familiar with. But Jesus says, no. This circle is much, much wider. And he knew he'd get in trouble for it. So I think it's yes, it's individual to offer your heart to surrender, but for the sake of the larger community. A couple books that I think have been very important to me. One is Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam. Came out about 20 years ago, and he cites the decline of social capital. Social capital is voluntary organizations, church attendance, Little League involvement, PTA, Rotary clubs. It's been on decline, so such that people are now bowling alone. And we're living in an individualized context more and more. His most recent book, called The Upswing, he's a retired chair of the Department of Sociology at Harvard, and lives in Jaffrey, New Hampshire, where I live. And his new book, or recent book, is called The Upswing. And he cites this, as he sees it, a transition in our country from the I culture beginning in the Gilded Age in the 1880s to a we culture that started after World War I, that we're all in relationship with one another, to an I culture that began in the mid-60s. And we're still kind of in the I culture, but he sees hope of people banding together across difference. Braver Angels being one of them, across difference, and that we can get to a we culture. My relationship with the living Christ is very, very important to me. And it's a personal relationship. It's a powerful relationship. My spiritual disciplines are among the most important things that I do. But that discipline invites me, impels me, encourages me to draw a wider circle. And as I say, some days when I'm anxious or afraid or tired, I don't want to do that. Yes, sir.
I am red, but I believe that I'm more Mandorla, and thank goodness that I've learned that today.
Yes.
Because, and John can attest, we can't get together and talk in a mature fashion anymore, in a civil way. And we quit talking, and that will never fix the problem.
Exactly. No, thank you for saying that. It's very, very difficult. Again, one of the gifts of Braver Angels and the design genius of the person who heads this department at the University of Minnesota is all conversations. There's a protocol. This is what we're going to do. And typically, if you get into a group and somebody says, these are the norms, do you accept the norms? And everybody nods their head, and then you move on. With Braver Angels, I mean, you spend a lot of time. It's not just a tacit nod of the head, that people really have to say, I'm into this. I'm willing to do this. And it's so, and you may imagine it's a self-selective group. People who just want to be anger entrepreneurs or fearmongers typically aren't coming on either side. And so there's this desire, can we be in relationship in a deeper way and move forward as a result of that? So I think that's important. Yeah, in the back.
Hi, thank you so much.
You're going to get a microphone here.
Scares me. Hi, thank you so much. I had a quick question. You mentioned something earlier about Saint Francis of Assisi and the connection to the mandorla. Could you repeat that? And the other thing that I was identifying with, just with symbolism and in the Bible and in all of our everything, in my growing up with everything in Episcopal teaching, is talking about red and blue. If you took away any of those colors in the mandorla, it wouldn't be as beautiful as it is. So the red complements the blue, and the blue complements the red. So it's the synergistic combination of everything in that. So that's just an example I was connecting to that.
Yeah. Hildegard of Bingen was a contemporary of Francis of Assisi, and it's reported in the 1200s that they had some correspondence with one another. And she was a remembered and respected figure from that era in her spiritual life. One more question, and then I'm going to have to wind up. Yeah. Well, wait for a microphone. It's on, I think. Yep.
Thank you for
Appreciate it.
giving us this speech. Have you given this approximate speech to the men next door to your office building in Newark? And how did it go over with them?
Yes. I don't know if I've given the speech, but we had a lot of back and forth. with each other. I remember one guy saying to me, he said, my life is supported by Psalm 91. And he goes, do you know Psalm 91? And I look, I don't know Psalm 91. And that's the eagle's wings, bear you up on eagle's wings. As soon as he asked me that, I ran to my office and looked up Psalm 91. And this was foundational to him. So we were teaching each other. I wasn't really speaking, as I'm doing now, doing teaching. I was more of a student in some ways with some of these guys.
What I'm driving at is, I have some things in common with you.
Yes.
Okay? The New Hampshire connection and all that. But what I'm wondering about, which creates difficulty, and the problem is the difference between people. And, you're up in your office on the fourth floor.
Right.
You go next door, and then
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, I think the challenge, the question is, as I'm going down next door to these guys who have a very different culture, all of different race, different life experience from me, do they understand me? And I think the challenge for me is for me to understand them. I lived in Japan for 2 years after college, and I went with the idea that I'm not an ugly American. Remember that term? I'd purged myself of all that. Well, 6 months in, I discovered that, maybe not. And something was off, and I went to talk to one of the students in the dormitory where I lived to ask him, what do you think is going on here? And he was very free to tell me. He said, first, you're younger than some of us. In Japan, many of them, many Japanese students take a year to study for the exam. So these guys were older than me. That's a big deal in Japan. He said, you speak English. We are here and we are committed to speak English, but when we get into anything that's of any kind of sophistication, you always win because you speak English better. And you're taller than the rest of us. And you lord it over us. That was devastating. I knew nothing of that. I didn't know any of that. It was devastating to me. And I sort of vowed I'd never put myself in that position again. Let me tell you, I've been in that position, I can't tell you how many times since, is to, try and be with people as much to the extent that we can. And it's not easy. I'm aware, and George is giving me the hook here.
That's such a great thing to end on. You go ahead. Keep going.
What a gift to be able to be with you and to have such robust conversation and deep reflection, and just applaud who you are and what you're about and the work that you do in this congregation and beyond. Let me offer a prayer as we finish. Gracious God, you have gathered us together in all the fullness of who we are. And may we continue to receive the blessings, the ones that we know about and the ones that we have yet to discover. And now as we break from this place and go to the places you would have us go, may we be reminded that we never break from you, because you always go with us, leading us, guiding us, and setting us free. And for that we're grateful. Amen. All right. Thank you all. Blessings.